Good evening, everyone. It is presently 9:45 p.m. on Thursday, January 16th, 2020. Today we shall be reading Part 2 of Unintended Consequences, a novel by John Ross. Now, before we begin, I would first like to make note of something important for editorial purposes. The copy of the text which I have in my possession, rather a digital PDF copy thereof, does not appear to have chapter titles or chapter numbers included. For the sake of convenience and better understanding, I have taken the liberty of adding chapter numbers and chapter titles to the original text. It is my hope that such will assist readers in better understanding and keeping track of the material and their progress through it. With that out of the way, let us begin. Unintended Consequences, a novel by John Ross. Part 2. Growth. Chapter 14. Enlistment for Airborne. May 12th, 1942. Listen, goddammit. I told you I was going to enlist, and this is the least you could do for me, for Christ's sake. But Max, Sophia pleaded, pronouncing his name Mex. You have a child. You are almost 30 years old. Your family needs you here. If you leave us, do it. But please, don't send this letter. It's a lie. I'm not going to get stuck on some base in Texas while there's a war going on in Europe. You have to sign this letter. It's the only way I'll get in the Airborne. The kid will be fine with you, and you can live with Father in St. Louis. You've been bitching about New York for 2 years now. He looked her in the eye. Jesus, I hope this stunt works, he thought. This woman is driving me crazy here. I would have thought you'd be more supportive. After all, it's your relatives that are being slaughtered over there by the fucking Krauts. His final words did it. Sophia Collins hung her head in shame and signed her name to the letter her husband had typed to the War Department. Chapter 15. Red Letter Propaganda. June 2nd, 1942. Collins, this has to be you. Jesus, man. You must have really wanted to get away from that wife of yours. I guess nobody will call you a liar anymore. Private Hemmings had just run into the barracks and now stood by Max Collins' bunk, holding out a folded section of the New York Times. Everyone in basic training had heard the story of how the oldest new recruit on the base had made his wife sign a letter to the War Department demanding they accept her husband for combat duty. Max stood looking down at the newspaper and laughed out loud. In the New York Times? I'll be a son of a bitch. He took the paper from the younger man and read the news item. Wife wants father of her child in combat. Begs War Department to put him in Airborne. New York Times staff report. Most women would weep at the thought of their husbands going into combat. A Polish-born woman in St. Louis, Missouri, however, has urged the War Department to make sure that her husband gets into the Airborne, even though he is 29 and they have a younger daughter. The letter was sent to one of the husband's relatives who is connected with the present administration. There it was forwarded to the appropriate department. In part, it reads as follows. My husband is strong man, and going nuts with war in Europe and nothing can do here. You must take him, or not good for me live with here more. My husband must go jump in where fight, not stay at Texas waste time. The letter goes on to state that the writer's American-born husband is very concerned for her family in Poland. The couple has not heard from any of them for almost 2 years. It is not often that a wife insists that her husband be accepted into the Airborne during wartime. Our thoughts and prayers are that such demands will soon be unnecessary. Well, I guess I'm not a liar after all, he said with a smile. Some of the other men looked at Max with dubious expressions. All of them were single, and few could imagine wanting to leave wife and child to join the 82nd Airborne. That was just one of the things that differentiated Max Collins from the other men. Chapter 16. Training Days. June 9th, 1942. Buell Anvil Jenkins was a short barrel-chested man with a look of perpetual disgust on his face. At 41, he was old enough to be the father of most of the other enlisted men on the Pensacola Naval Air Station, and a few of the officers. A year earlier, he had been the hard-drinking crew chief of an Ohio dirt track team that had aspirations for a shot at the Indianapolis 500. His nickname came from the fact that he built durable cars. My rides don't break, he often said. They ain't the lightest ones on the track, but They'll be there at the finish if the damn drivers do their part. One day a new mechanic had made a mistake when working on the steering of the team's sprint car, and the driver had crashed into the wall during practice. When Jenkins had discovered the cause of the accident, he had hit the mechanic hard enough to detach his retina, leaving him blind in the left eye. The judge had given Anvil Jenkins the choice of 5 to 10 years in Marion prison, or the opportunity to serve his country in the war that the judge felt the United States was sure to join. Despite his age and lack of prior service, the Navy needed men with Jenkins's exceptional mechanical skills. The mechanic had chosen the second option, but not without considerable deliberation. Jenkins, with his uncommon talent, had quickly become a qualified airframe and power plant mechanic in the Navy, but he hated it. He had the best tools and equipment to work with that he had ever seen, but it was wasted. The airplanes, especially the chunky old Stearman biplanes, had engines that were antiquated by race car standards, and the planes themselves were boring. The young flyers were worse prima donnas than the most irritating race car driver he'd ever met, and they treated him like he was the garbage man instead of the one who made sure they didn't fall out of the sky. The officers were the worst of all. It was more than he could stand to have to call these young punks sir, and he had gained a reputation for never speaking unless he absolutely had to. One of them was walking towards him now. "Mind if I help with that damaged wingtip, Chief Jenkins? I'm a fair hand with wood. I know it wasn't my student that ground coupled it, but I like these planes and I'm not doing anything else. Can you use some help?" Jenkins was surprised by the request and curious, so he grunted his agreement. Never seen a college boy yet could use his hands, he thought. "Lieutenant Walter Bowman," said the young man, extending his right hand with a smile. The old man shook Bowman's hand without expression and was surprised to feel calluses on it. "Folks call me Anvil, sir," Jenkins replied without explaining. In the next 2 hours they worked quietly together, with the mechanic occasionally giving a brief suggestion to the superior officer. Anvil Jenkins immediately learned that the young pilot had great woodworking skill. His own experience had always been with metal, but Jenkins could see craftsmanship in any area, and the young man obviously had talent. "Now why do you like these old Stearmans so much, sir?" the older man finally asked. "I figured you'd much rather be in a fighter." Bowman shrugged and gave an answer the mechanic had never expected. "Fighters are fast all right, and they're getting better all the time, but there's maneuvers I'd be afraid to try in every one I've ever flown. You can't break a Stearman without flying it into the ground." Anvil Jenkins looked up and Bowman misinterpreted his look of surprise. "Don't believe me? What's the red line speed on a Stearman? It doesn't have one. What's the maneuvering speed? It doesn't have one of those either. You can put a Stearman in a vertical dive with full power from 10,000 feet until it won't go any faster, and then haul back on the stick as hard as you can. And you might black out, but you won't break anything. Most planes will have the tail come off in the dive, and the ones that stay together there will have the wings come off in the pullout. I honestly don't believe you can hurt one of these yellow perils while it's still in the air. That's why I like these old yellow open cockpit biplanes," he said with finality. "So this is the guy who bet one of the other instructors that a Stearman wouldn't lose its wings in a maximum G pullout," Jenkins thought. "That was you, huh? Pretty relaxed about the taxpayers' money, ain't you, sir?" The mechanic expected a reprimand for his tone of voice, but the young lieutenant was smiling. Bowman shook his head. "I knew they'd stay on. I even offered to try it without a chute." He winked to let the mechanic know that his last statement was a joke. Anvil Jenkins looked at his own powerful arms and then at Bowman's thinner ones. The words that came out of his mouth startled him. "Lieutenant, what if you'd had another 200 pounds in the plane and 2 more arms hauling back on the other stick to pull out faster?" Walter Bowman was already heading for the door. "One way to find out, Anvil." The Stearman's 220 horsepower Continental engine fired up on the second revolution. As he watched from the front cockpit, Anvil Jenkins could not believe what he was seeing. He didn't much like flying straight and level in airplanes, let alone trying to make them disintegrate in midair. His stomach was churning, and they were still on the ground. Walter Bowman gave the engine full power and shoved the stick forward while stepping on the brakes. The tail wheel lifted off the ground, although the plane was stationary. He pulled back slightly on the stick, keeping the biplane balanced on the mains only, and released the brakes. Through judicious use of power, stick, and brakes, Bowman taxied the Stearman out to the end of the runway without ever letting the tail wheel touch the ground. Damn, thought Jenkins. I heard about this, but I never saw it. Looks like a good driver steering with a throttle. Guy's having fun with his favorite airplane. There wasn't another pilot on the base who could taxi a Stearman on the mains without pulling a prop into the asphalt. For a few minutes, Anvil Jenkins began to feel a little better about the whole endeavor. His comfort was short-lived. It seemed to take forever to get the biplane to altitude, and as it climbed slowly, Anvil Jenkins's wish to be on the ground grew stronger. What kind of idiot goes up in an airplane trying to tear it apart? We don't even know if these chutes'll work. Hell, we don't even know if there's really chutes in these backpacks. The plan was looking more and more like insanity with every additional foot of altitude. At 10,000 feet, Walter Bowman pounded on the fuselage with his fist, and the mechanic turned in his seat to see Bowman nod his head. Anvil Jenkins turned forward, took a deep breath, clamped his left hand on the back of his neck, and began to count 20. Immediately, Bowman shoved the control stick all the way forward. The engine was already at full throttle. The Stearman nosed over sharply, and the two occupants were forced upward against their harnesses. Oh, Jesus, Jenkins thought. The mechanic's stomach felt as if it had relocated itself to a spot underneath his breastbone. When they were looking straight at the ground, Walter Bowman eased off on the forward pressure, and the plane stabilized in an altitude that was slightly past vertical. He had explained to the mechanic during the pre-flight that if you aimed the plane straight down, the shape of the wing's airfoil would cause the plane to move forward slightly. To get a true node-lift dive and the absolute maximum speed, the aircraft had to be positioned slightly past vertical, so that it would fly straight down. No wonder fighter planes have their tails flutter and disintegrate, Jenkins thought dismally, as the shriek of the wind flowing over the flying wires increased in pitch. Anvil Jenkins had never felt such pure terror in his life. The pilot had told him that it would take 16 seconds for the plane to reach a speed where wind resistance would let it go no faster. Kid must have timed it with a stopwatch, Jenkins thought. Crazy fucker does this shit for fun. Guy said to count to 20 because I'd probably be excited and count fast. The mechanic reached a count of 20, but the pitch of the screaming wires was still changing. No way. No way this college boy is going to tell me I jumped the gun, he thought grimly. He stopped counting but kept his hand behind his head. When the tremendous noise in his ears stopped changing in pitch, he raised his left elbow slightly to signal the young man in back, and pulled his arms down into the cockpit where his left hand joined his right one on the control stick. Anvil Jenkins pulled the control stick towards his gut with all his might. His upper body was thick and powerful, and at that moment he was charged with more adrenaline than he had ever been in his entire life. Walter Bowman's hands were already on his own control stick. When he saw Anvil's hand drop from behind his neck, he tensed his stomach muscles as hard as he could, and then hauled back on the controls with all of his strength. Just as he started, he felt the older man's efforts join his own, and the stick moved backwards more quickly than he had ever experienced. The elevator was forced against the stops, a feat Bowman had only accomplished at lower speeds before, and the controls would move no further. New sounds emanated from the screaming aircraft as the atmosphere was forced in a new path over the tail's control surfaces. Bowman had experienced high G-forces before, but none like this. His body pressed into the seat as if it weighed over 1,800 pounds. The aircraft was almost level in passing through 4,000 feet. Walter Bowman noticed that his own peripheral vision was diminishing, but Jenkins was still helping hold the controls against the stops. Bowman smiled into the horrendous wind blast. The G-forces were dragging the flesh on his cheeks and lips downwards, making the young man's face look like something out of a carnival funhouse. Suddenly, the controls got much heavier in Walter Bowman's hands. Anvil Jenkins had released his pull on the stick, and Bowman knew that Jenkins had either lost his nerve or blacked out. Positive G-forces drove the blood out of the brain and could cause unconsciousness at modest levels if the passenger were a neophyte, or in anyone if the forces were high enough. It was a lesson Walter demonstrated to each new cadet on his first flight by pulling enough Gs to put the new student out. It taught respect for the dangers of flight. It also caused the young lieutenant to be referred to as Blackout Bowman by his contemporaries on the base. Walter Bowman relaxed back pressure, reduced power, and was prepared to let the biplane fly itself into level equilibrium when suddenly the stick jerked forward in his hands and the airplane nosed over again into a dive. Bowman pulled back as hard as he could, but the stick wouldn't budge. He immediately realized what had happened. The unconscious man had slumped forward onto his own control stick. The G-forces had caused Jenkins' heavy body to compress the seat pack emergency chute enough to make the harness loose. Bowman's chute pack, after daily high-G maneuvers, had already been as solid as a rock. The pilot knew that he couldn't possibly budge the other man by pulling on the stick, so he did the only logical thing. Bowman pushed the controls forward to steepen the descent. As negative G's raised the unconscious man's body off the stick, Walter pushed his own control hard against his left knee. The biplane started to roll, and when it was inverted, Bowman leveled the wings. The airplane was now flying upside down at a speed of about 170 knots, descending in a steep dive at a rate of over 3,000 feet per minute. Walter pushed the stick forward, raising the nose until the biplane was flying straight and level. The pilot and the mechanic were suspended in their harnesses, blood rushing to their heads. The unconscious mechanic's arms flailed over his head in the windstream. Walter flew the plane upside down on a level heading towards the airfield and waited for the older man to regain consciousness. When Anvil Jenkins came to, he immediately realized he was about to die. "I'm falling out of the plane!" he screamed silently to himself. "It's upside down and about to crash!" The mechanic frantically grabbed the edges of the cockpit to hold himself in. "I'm strapped in. Got to unbuckle this harness to bail out. Oh Christ, the ground's right there. And where's the release? I didn't practice this. Shit, where's the fucking harness Before he could get a grip on the quick-release mechanism, the plane miraculously righted itself and flew normally. Jenkins held onto the sides of the open cockpit with a death grip, hyperventilating and waiting for the plane to try and kill him again. When he remembered where he was and who he was with, he turned in his seat to look behind him and saw the smiling young face of Lieutenant Bowman, who was giving him the thumbs-up signal. Waves of relief swept over him, coupled with stark horror that he was the one who had suggested this adventure. The trip back to base was uneventful, if you ignored the snap roll that Walter Bowman executed on final approach at an altitude of 300 feet. When the plane finally rolled to a stop on the flight line, Anvil Jenkins climbed down out of it on shaking legs. The mechanic resisted the overpowering impulse to lie down on the asphalt and hug the earth. He could feel his heart rate slowly returning to normal. Bowman was smiling at him. "You've got a hell of a set of arms, mister. We bottomed out the elevator with the airspeed indicator pegged." "Guy actually looks happy," Jenkins realized with astonishment. "Better get my sorry ass together, for he thinks I should be wearing diapers." What'd we pull, sir?" Jenkins asked. The mechanic noticed that it didn't bother him so much to address the young officer properly. "Anybody's guess. My peripheral vision was closing in, so I was getting close to a blackout myself, even with this damn thing on the last notch." Lieutenant Bowman unzipped his flight suit to expose a thick leather harness that compressed his abdomen like a corset, which he then began to unbuckle. The mechanic looked at him quizzically. "I had it custom made. Holds your guts in on high-G maneuvers. Keeps you from blacking out as soon. I've pulled 8 Gs with it before, in a plane with a meter, and didn't feel anything like we got today. I'd say we saw at least 10. Probably." The mechanic shook his head in amazement and reached over to pluck at one of the flying wires, expecting it to have lost some tension. It thrummed like the string on a bass guitar. Bowman tied the plane down, and the two men headed back to the hangar. The mechanic was thinking. "Awfully strong airframe, but a little shy on power, ain't she, sir?" the man ventured, remembering how long it had taken the 220-horsepower Continental to get them to 10,000 feet. "Oh, no need to buy expensive engines and burn twice the fuel just to train cadets," Bowman replied realistically. "I could do something about that, sir," the old man found himself saying. He was starting to feel eager about something for the first time since joining the Navy. Bowman turned towards him and brightened visibly. "Oh, that's right. You build race car engines." He frowned and shook his head. "I think the brass would come down hard if they found out you modified an engine in a trainer. It wouldn't be worth it for a few more horsepower." Anvil Jenkins let out the first laugh anyone on the base had ever heard him utter. "You kidding? A few more horsepower? Hell, I ain't talking about trying to soup up one of them worthless Continental stem winders. The thing was out of date the day the first crankcase came out on the foundry. This ain't the racetrack with some damn rule book to get around. I got me a wrecked SNJ sitting back in the hangar. Think you could fly that plane of yours with a real engine in front of you? Eh, sir? Walter Bowman was not a man who was easily surprised, but his jaw dropped. The SNJ was a heavy all-metal trainer. It was powered by a Pratt & Whitney Wasp 9-cylinder radial that produced 600 horsepower. You want to put a Wasp in a Stearman? Bowman was incredulous but thrilled at the same time. What about the CG? He was referring to the change in the center of gravity the heavier engine would make, but already he was thinking of the solution. The plane's got such big control surfaces, moving the CG forward would probably make it more stable, and we could probably relocate some components aft, section the front of the fuselage. He was imagining his airplane with almost triple the power. Damn, Jenkins, the thing would climb like a rocket. What else you reckon you'd want to change, sir? Jenkins had his head cocked and was eyeing the younger man speculatively. A wish list, eh? Well, ailerons on all four wings for one, for better roll. Maybe aileron spades, too, to reduce control pressure. Shorten the wings, even. Shorten the throw on the stick, too, if we don't need as much leverage anymore. Lighter gear if cadets aren't going to fly it. His voice trailed off. Hell, what am I saying? We'd both face court-martial if you started sawing on one of the trainers on the flight line. Anvil Jenkins looked at the young man with an evil grin, and for a moment he forgot who he was talking to. Those college boys may run most of this base, but I run the maintenance shop. I got me a Stearman in the back with a cracked block and some gear damage. And if I say it ain't fit to return to service with students, then it ain't. And that's that. I got me that wrecked SNJ, and before you tell me the base might need it for parts, let me tell you that we got another wrecked one behind the south hangar. And if these cadets of yours keep slamming them in the runway like they've been doing, we're gonna have another wrecked one pretty soon. And the one spare part we don't seem to need is engines. Because the Pratt & Whitney's a pure D anvil. Unless I start draining all the oil out of them before putting them on the front line, we're likely to end up with nothing but busted airframes with 100% engines by the time this damn war's over. Now, you got you a ride what won't bust less you run into something, and I reckon you ain't gonna do that, but it's got no steam. He spat on the tarmac. Well, if you want to put together a Stearman that'd make a Boeing engineer's hair stand on end, and you want to do most of your own woodwork, 'cause I'm a hammer man myself, but I got me a machine shop Wilbur Shaw would kill for, and I'm sick of seeing it used on nothing but these aeroplanes that look like they was taken to a demolition derby by drunk kids in short pants. Lieutenant Bowman was astonished. He didn't know it, but he had just heard the longest continuous utterance Anvil Jenkins had issued since his forced enlistment in the Navy during the previous war. He was at a loss for words as he looked at his watch absent-mindedly. I've got to check in. When can I look at the Stearman? I'll be at the shop all night, sir. Come by after dinner if you want. I will, the younger lieutenant said, nodding slowly as he turned to leave. He was still shaking his head when one of the other instructors hailed him near the officers' club. Didn't I see you with Jenkins by the hangar? What were you doing with that sour old prick? I'm not sure, Bowman said with a puzzled look on his face. I think I may have created a monster. Well. Next chapter here. Cattle Drive. Chapter 17. Cattle Drive. August 6th, 1942. Both of you, on your feet. You will come with us. The four men in uniform looked terrifying to the young couple. But no talking. The soldier in charge looked at Erwin. You have 1 minute to pack a bag. You, he said, addressing Hermann Mann's 23-year-old wife, Magda, will not need anything else. Now, he commanded. At least they won't be detaining her overnight, Erwin thought. As if in a daze, the young grocer retrieved a battered case from under their bed and hastily put some clothes and toiletries in it. He wanted to find out where they were taking him, but the four soldiers with submachine guns did not look as though they would be agreeable to questions right now. As they left the small shop, Erwin took out his keys to lock up. One of the soldiers snatched them from his hand. We will take care of your shop for you, he said in a tone that invited no argument. Erwin and Magda, flanked by the 4 soldiers, walked down Bahnhofstrasse. As they came up to the edge of the railway station, Hermann Mann's heart sank. There were scores of Jews being herded along towards a freight train. All of them were men. "I don't believe your husband has a ticket for this one, Frau Mann," said one of the soldiers, and his 3 companions broke out into raucous laughter. 2 of them started to lead the girl away. Wait! You can't!" The rifle butt hit him squarely in the solar plexus, and Hermann Mann was immediately doubled over in agony. He could neither talk nor breathe. "Oh, don't you worry, Herr Mann," one of the 2 departing soldiers said over his shoulder. "I assure you that your wife will not be bored. I am sure that our fine soldiers will keep your little Polish cunt occupied in ways you have never imagined." The others laughed as they picked Erwin up and threw him bodily through the open door of the freight car. "Erwin! Erwin! 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 Erwin!" Magda screamed as the freight car door clanged shut. They would never see each other again. Chapter 18. The Warsaw Ghetto. August 8th, 1942. Hermann Mann still couldn't believe it. The day before yesterday I was working in my produce and grocery shop in Danzig, he thought. Now I'm packed like a piece of livestock into a vile-smelling railway car. The train had made several stops to pick up more citizens, but no one had been permitted to get off. There were now so many of them in such a small space that if anyone fainted from fatigue, he would be held erect by the closeness of the others around him. The passengers' requests to be allowed to relieve themselves had been ignored. The oppressive heat generated by so many human bodies packed together made the inevitable result all the more nauseating. Erwin knew they were being taken to Warsaw. The men in the freight car had talked freely at first. Then, as their confinement in the darkness of their current prison had continued, Erwin had seen their spirit disintegrate. Now, no one is speaking, Erwin thought. Many of these men have much more education than I, and are in well-respected professions. Their demoralization was overwhelming. Erwin, too, felt the crushing reality of what was happening to him build on itself. But he was a younger man than most of those around him, and he had not yet lost his young man's unerring faith in what the future held in store. The train finally arrived at its ultimate destination. The air brakes filled the cars with a cacophony of hisses, squeals, and sounds of creaking metal as they gradually dragged over 1,200 tons of freight train to a halt. Immediately, the passengers heard the sounds of soldiers pounding on the latches to open the freight doors on the sides of the cars. When the doors swung open, all the people inside squinted in the bright sunlight as they stumbled and fell out of the cars. Erwin was stronger and quicker than most of the others, and he escaped the wrath of the soldiers who stood to the sides of each freight car door, urging the captives out. "Move! You are delaying the others!" A soldier was prodding a man of about 60 with the bayonet attached to the muzzle of his rifle. The man had fallen from the freight car to the gravel and wrenched his ankle. The soldier kicked him in the thigh. "Jewish filth! You have soiled yourself! Animals!" Ugh! He spat on the fallen figure and turned to vent his anger on another captive. When Hermann Mann adjusted to the bright daylight, he was amazed at what he saw. The railroad yard appeared to be at the edge of a city. A high wall extended as far as he could see between where he stood and the city itself. At an opening in the wall, Nazi soldiers armed with submachine guns stood guard. Can this wall extend all the way around the city? He asked himself in disbelief. They have transformed all of Warsaw into a prison camp. "Your things are being unloaded now. Take them, and get moving." Erwin looked in the direction of the soldier's gaze and saw some shabby-looking Jews haphazardly throwing suitcases and duffel bags off one of the freight cars. "Get going," the soldier commanded. And to emphasize his point, he jabbed at the people nearest him with his bayonet, eliciting 2 screams. Erwin followed the others towards the pile of baggage. He noticed a woman among the group. None of them are under 35. A feeling of dread ran through him as he located his bag and followed some of the others towards the gap in the wall. When they passed through it, Hermann Mann saw that his suspicions had been accurate. They were in the city of Warsaw, and the wall extended around all of it that he could see. There were other drab-looking people off in the distance. The entire tableau before him was one of utter despair. "Now what?" asked an elderly man standing near Hermann Mann. He was addressing no one in particular. "I think we're on our own," Mann said as he started walking into the city. Chapter 19. Trainer and Craftsman. August 10th, 1942. "More right rudder! More right rudder, damn it!" Lieutenant Walter Bowman yelled into the funnel. Hell, Bowman thought. He can't hear me any better than any of the others could. The instructor looked at the back of his student's head and felt foolish for even trying to use the ridiculous intercom. The Stearman biplane, in Walter Bowman's very biased view, was one of the finest creations on Earth, but the funnel and tube communication system was an utter joke. Bowman unbuckled his harness and prepared to effect the cure that had unintentionally become one of his trademarks. Grabbing the edge of the cockpit with his left hand, and the semicircular cutout in the trailing edge of the upper wing with his right, Bowman lifted himself to a crouched position in the hole in the fuselage in which he had been sitting a second before. With a fluid movement that was the result of having performed this particular maneuver many times in the past, he swung his right leg over the edge of the cockpit and planted his foot firmly on the wing root of the right lower wing. It took serious effort to combat the strong wind blast provided by both the plane's 80-knot forward speed and the prop wash of the big propeller. Using the bracing wires and the wing strut for handholds, Walter Bowman put all his weight on his right foot, pulled his left leg out of the rear cockpit, and took 2 more steps into the wind blast until he stood on the part of the wing next to the front cockpit hole in the fuselage. The student snapped his head to the right and his eyes grew wide inside his flight goggles. He had been rendered unconscious on his first flight with this insane man, and he had been told by his fellow cadets to expect this current atrocity. But it still had not prepared him for the sight of his instructor standing on the wing of the airplane that he, and he alone, was now flying. Bowman held the edge of the front cockpit with his left hand and a bracing wire with his right. He leaned over and put his mouth next to the cadet's ear. "You've got the nose too high. We're still in a climb, and that's why we don't have any speed," he yelled. He let go of the edge of the cockpit and reached in to tap the face of the altimeter for emphasis. "I told you on the ground to level out at 5,000. Look." The student, momentarily horrified that his instructor had let go of one of his handholds, looked at the altimeter. The clock-like hands showed that they were at 5,200 feet. Bowman grabbed the control stick and said, "I've got it. Keep your feet on the rudders." He pushed the stick forward until the plane was flying straight and level. His position on the side was an awkward one from which to try to exert force on the controls, and it took considerable effort. The airspeed indicator started to climb gradually. He pushed harder, lowering the nose further, and the big Stearman began a slight descent. Keeping an eye on the altimeter, he leveled the plane at 5,000 feet. "Hold it there," he commanded. He released his grip on the stick when he saw that his student had control of it. "Do you see the position of the horizon?" The student nodded his assent. "That's what straight and level looks like. Try to remember it. Now," he shouted, tapping at the face of another gauge on the panel. "Look at your slip and skid indicator." The device he was pointing to was a curved, fluid-filled tube, aligned like a frown. A black ball floated in the clear liquid, somewhat closer to the right end of the tube than the left. "You need more right rudder. Step on the ball, remember?" The student nodded vigorously as he increased pressure on the right rudder pedal. The black ball drifted a bit left of center as the cadet pushed a little too hard with his right leg, then settled in the proper center position when he relaxed pressure slightly. "That's good," Bowman yelled. "After I get back in, I want you to show me a 360 to the left and then one to the right. Stay at 5,000 feet. The student nodded, his eyes looking at the relationship of the horizon with the leading edge of the top wing. Bowman tapped the slip and skid indicator once more for emphasis. "Make sure your turns stay coordinated while you're in your bank. Then head for home." He patted the cadet on the shoulder, climbed back into his own cockpit, buckled his safety harness, and flexed his muscles in his feet and calves to relax them. The student looked over his shoulder and saw his instructor nod his head. He rolled the biplane into a 30-degree bank to the left and held it there. "The nose is a little low, and we're going to lose a little altitude," Bowman thought. His rudder control is spot on, though. Walter Bowman didn't need to look at his own instrument panel to judge the young man's efforts. When a turn and bank was properly coordinated, the people in the plane didn't feel their bodies pushed to the outside or falling to the inside of the turn. Walter's favorite demonstration of proper control coordination, when he was in an enclosed plane, was to set a water glass on the top of the instrument panel and fill it from a pitcher without spilling a drop. This would be no great feat, except that Walter Bowman did it while making the airplane perform a barrel roll. It was a demonstration that had won him not only the respect of the other instructors on the base, but also quite a bit of their pocket money as well. As the student rolled out of the left-hand 360-degree turn, he saw that he had lost almost 100 feet of altitude. Pushing the stick to the right to roll into his right-hand turn, he increased back pressure on it to raise the nose slightly. His instructor smiled. "This kid's going to be one of the better ones," he thought. Walter Bowman never lost sight of the fact that in an all-too-short time, his pupils were going to be using their new skills in a much more hostile environment than clear skies over the coast of the Florida Panhandle. When Ensign Taylor Lowell rolled the wings level on his original heading, he looked at his altimeter. It read a fraction over 4,900 feet. His second 360-degree turn had been made holding a constant altitude. Ensign Lowell felt a surge of pride that surprised him with its intensity. The fear of not measuring up that accompanied the excitement of flying dropped down a notch. With a sixth sense about such matters, Lieutenant Bowman felt the difference in the young man's altitude, and smiled. When they turned back towards the base, he elected to let his student fly it all the way into the landing pattern before taking over the controls for the landing itself. On the way back to the airfield, the big biplane felt a little more steady, its heading a little more consistent, and the thrum of its engine just a little more smooth. "How'd the babes in the woods do today, Blackout?" Lieutenant Homer Tapscott was grinning at his friend and fellow flight instructor. "I can see you're going to have to requisition another flight suit. The Navy doesn't tolerate shoddy uniforms, you know." Bowman looked down and saw that the bottom of his right pant leg had finally become frayed from high-speed flapping in the wind. The right ones always seem to wear through first, he thought. The supply clerk must be getting used to seeing me every 10 days or so. Any day that ends with the birds still airworthy and free from vomit is a success in my book, Bowman said pleasantly. Walter Bowman was the only instructor at Panascola whose students had never damaged an airplane, but he had not been able to prevent a few of them from throwing up. "The kids they're sending us seem to be getting younger and greener every month." "Nah, we're just getting old." Lieutenants Tapscott and Bowman were each 26. "I'm done for the day. Care to join me at the OC for a bit? Grab a Coke?" Tapscott knew his friend never drank alcohol. Walter Bowman's smile was small, but it showed excited anticipation. "Not today, friend. I'll have to pass. I heard Anvil had some good news for me. I think I'll go take a look at his welds." He turned his back and started to walk towards the hangars. He could guess what Tapscott's reaction would be. "He got the mount finished? The hell with the officers' club. I gotta see this." Homer Tapscott broke into a trot to catch up with his friend. The big Stearman looked considerably different than it had several months earlier. The wings were 21 inches shorter on each side, and the upper ones had ailerons just like the lowers. The wing struts, handholds, and step had all been reshaped to make them more streamlined. Everywhere that the biplane had been square and angular, it was now more rounded. The landing gear was lighter, and slightly taller to compensate for the larger prop that the craft would be using. And the main wheels were covered with beautiful hand-formed aluminum wheel pants with flawless welds. "Just like making little bitty sprint car bodies," Anvil Jenkins had proclaimed. The biggest change, however, was in front of the firewall. Where once had been a 6-cylinder Continental engine displacing 540 cubic inches, now sat a 9-cylinder Pratt & Whitney radial with 1,320 inches of displacement. Jenkins saw the two men looking at the engine and walked over to them. "Got it back further than we thought, Lieutenant. Replaced a couple of things on the firewall that were in the way." Walter Bowman saw that this was a gross understatement. "And got her snugged all in tight. Be stronger that way, too. Engine won't have as much leverage with a mount a couple inches shorter than the one that came off it." Bowman examined the handmade engine mount. It was a beautifully formed piece made of myriad short sections of steel tubing expertly welded together. Every part of it had been triangulated. There was not a single bend in any section of tubing. It didn't look heavy, but Bowman knew he would have to crash the plane to make the engine mount flex. Been thinking about what kind of prop to use. I figure you want her to climb like a bandit, sir, so we need one with a flat pitch if you're going to spin her up 500 revolutions per minute more than what you're turning now. Maybe have to have one made. What? Exclaimed Lieutenant Tapscott in disbelief. Turn a Wasp 500 over redline? You'll blow it up. Walter Bowman smiled. I told Anvil I didn't want to exceed factory stress levels. He lightened all the reciprocating parts and cut down the counterweights on the crank to balance it. We got 3 of the slide rule geniuses in artillery to give us a new red line based on the new receipt weights. They all 3 came up with the same number independently. Should run all day at the new setting. Tapscott was speechless. Shaved the heads, too, along with cleaning up the ports. I think the engineers at Pratt were maybe planning to sell these engines to some Mexicans who'd run 'em on creosote. Gotta drink grape juice now, but hell, Lieutenant, we got plenty of that. Anvil Jenkins was explaining how he'd raised the engine's compression ratio and increased its ability to consume the air-fuel mixture that fed it. Aviation fuels were color-coded by grade, with the highest octane, 115 out of 145, having a purple tint that earned it the nickname grape juice. What about torque factor? It had been some time since Homer Tapscott had ventured into the hangar, and he was awed by what had taken shape there. Jenkins smiled. We've been wondering about that, sir. Made the rudder about 20% bigger, but I figure that old Pratt's going to be kicking out at least 800, maybe 850. Don't think Lieutenant Bowman's going to want to use full throttle on takeoff, or he might end up on his back. And I suggest nobody get in an ass-kicking contest with him in a few months. If he flies this bird as much as I expect, he's going to have the strongest fucking right leg on this airbase, sir. The mechanic was referring to a phenomenon called P-factor, where, in a climb, the right rudder of an airplane's propeller had more thrust than its left, necessitating the pilot's use of additional right rudder. The effect was increasingly pronounced with more powerful engines. It's going to be airworthy that soon? Tapscott was amazed. Seems like the greenies are banging up the trainers less often these days, sir, and the kids in the shop here are kind of itchy to see if this thing will really fly. They got kind of a different attitude about their job since they seen that ass-over tea kettle thing the lieutenant here did last week. We better get back, Homer. I've got ground school to teach. It's looking great, Jenkins. It's an anvil, sir, the mechanic said with a grin. The 2 officers returned smiles and departed the hangar. Anvil Jenkins' comment about the junior mechanics referred to the fact that Walter Bowman, in his endless quest to find out what a steerman could do, had discovered a flight maneuver no one on the base had ever seen, and had performed it for the base on the 4th of July. In virtually all maneuvers by aerobatic aircraft, although the airplane might be pointed straight up, straight down, on its side, or even upside down, it is still flying. That is to say, the plane is still responding to control inputs because at least one of the movable control surfaces still has air flowing smoothly over it. In a stall, the wings quit flying, but the rudder and elevator are still effective, and can be used to get the wings providing lift again. In a spin, one wing is not flying, so the plane corkscrews down, but the rudder and elevator are again still effective, and can break the plane out of the spin. A snap roll is merely a horizontal spin while flying straight and level. It is performed by forcing one wing to quit flying by abrupt use of elevator and rudder, then reversing the process so that both wings provide lift again after the aircraft has made one revolution. Even in a tail slide, where the plane is flown straight up and allowed to fall back, air is flowing forwards over the elevator and rudder, and moving either of these controls will flip the plane over to where it is flying forward again. Walter Bowman had discovered that it was difficult, but possible, to make a steerman quit flying altogether. With little fuel and with some lead weights firmly bolted to the inside of the plane's fuselage behind the rear cockpit, the aircraft's center of gravity was past its aft safe limit as determined by Boeing engineers. In this configuration, Bowman found that if he initiated a climbing inverted snap roll at a higher than average rate of speed and held the controls in that position rather than reversing them to end the maneuver, the steerman would tumble. To an observer on the ground, the maneuver looked the same as if a toy metal plane, designed only to sit on the mantle, had been grabbed by the back end and thrown like a tomahawk across the sky. No 2 performances of this maneuver were quite the same. the plane tumbled randomly. After 2 or 3 somersaults, the huge amount of drag produced by the large wing and fuselage surfaces slowed the Stearman to where it started to fall out of the sky. When it did, it would enter a spin, either an upright one or inverted. These are both standard aerobatic maneuvers, though horrifying to the uninitiated, from which any accomplished aerobatic pilot can recover. The tumble that preceded them, however, was a new one to everyone on the base. The pilots at Pensacola had taken to calling the maneuver a B-squared, math notation for BB, which stood for Blackout Bowman. The young lieutenant did not think he had invented something no one else had ever done before. He just couldn't find anyone who had ever heard of such a maneuver, let alone seen it. 30 years later, the maneuver would be common at air shows around the country. It would be called a lomsevak, a Czechoslovakian term given to the maneuver by a Czech pilot who had mastered it in the early 1970s in a Zlin. The word had no literal English translation. Loosely interpreted, it means, "I have drunk too much wine and my head feels awful." Aerobatic pilots after 1972 would often refer to it as the hunky headache. The airshow circuit pilots who would employ the lomsevak in their repertoire in future decades would perform it in purpose-built competition aerobatic machines such as the Zlin, Pitts Special, Crescent Eagle, and the Laser. None would use a Stearman, which became a staple of air shows but which would be generally relegated to wing-walking acts. Few pilots, 50 years after World War II, would trust the structural integrity of a plane originally built for $1,500 in 1929 to endure the stresses created by a lomsevak. Fewer still would bolt lead to a plane built in 1929 and move the center of gravity aft of its design limit just to see how much caution the original engineers had exercised. And not a single one of them would have Walter Bowman's absolute certainty that a Stearman could do anything if only you were good enough. Chapter 20. Training Day. September 12th, 1942. Okay. Feet together. Hands up on the risers. Knees bent slightly. Get ready to drop and roll. Max Collins ran through everything he had been taught and had practiced in jump training. There was one thing Collins could not do, however, and that was change the fact that he was 6 foot 3 inches tall and weighed 203 pounds in his underwear. The jump master had warned Collins time and again that he was going to hit hard under a 24-foot canopy while carrying 40 pounds of gear. The other men in his unit were a good 40 to 50 pounds lighter, and for the first time in his life, Max Collins wished he were smaller. He had made 31 jumps and had felt every one of them. This was his 32nd. Wind's moving me back and right. Okay, twist a little and... Max Collins' feet hit the ground just a little sooner than he had anticipated, and he had not yet tensed his ankles as he had been taught to. As he slammed into the hard-packed earth, there was a pop that he felt all the way up to his knee. Shit! Broken ankle, he thought instantly, and cursed himself for failing to remain vigilant. He rolled on the ground and came up on his one good leg, hopping towards the canopy to keep the line slack so the chute wouldn't drag him. Damn, thought Collins, for what would not be the last time. Then another thought filled his mind, and he focused on it. I am going to heal, and I am not going to let this put me on the sidelines. By God, I'm not. New chapter. Chapter 21. Prelude to Revolution. April 17th, 1943. Hermann Mann stared at Stern, waiting for him to speak. The older man's eyes were fixed on 4 handguns which lay on a dilapidated table in front of him. He doesn't look happy, Erwin thought. And little wonder. 4 well-worn pistols in several calibers, with only a handful of ammunition that may not even fire. Not much to bet our lives on, especially after his speech last night. Hermann Mann looked around at the others. The faces of many of the men showed unmistakable signs of defeat. Fear was there also. It hung like a noxious fog in the crowded room. The penalty for having a gun was death, and each man there knew it. None of these men had been soldiers. None had even been policemen. Not one had ever himself owned a firearm. I doubt any of us know how to use them, even if they do work, Erwin thought grimly. No surprise Stern doesn't know what to say. We are doomed, came a voice from the group. The older man looked up, but could not tell who had spoken. "We are certainly doomed if we do nothing," Stearman said. "The Nazis have been shipping our people away by the trainload. I can scarcely believe that we were so blind as to think it could be to some place better. But maybe it is someplace better. They say it is because of the overcrowding here." The speaker's voice had a desperate sound. Stearman fixed him with a penetrating stare, and Erwin saw that Stearman was acting as a leader should, diffusing the feeling of hopelessness that threatened to kill the resistance movement before it had made even a symbolic gesture. "Are you volunteering to go on the next train, then? Or are you eager to promise the Nazis you will help them fill the train with other heads for this better place, if they let you stay here?" The man turned his face away in shame at Stearman's question. The reality the men in the group faced was so overwhelming, no one dared speak of it. The decision to implement the final solution had been made by the German High Command in early 1942. The residents of the Warsaw Ghetto did not know that exactly, but they were well aware that railroad cars were leaving Warsaw every few days with hundreds of their people. It was impossible for them not to piece together what was happening. Nazi soldiers hinted broadly at the fitting end their leaders had devised for the subhuman creatures whose existence they had been forced to endure for so long. At the Battle of Stalingrad in late 1942, Germany's advance to the east had been stopped in its tracks. Almost 1 million German troops had perished in that battle alone. Everyone knew that it was just a matter of time before the Nazis were defeated, so some residents of the ghetto were doing their best to get along with their captors, trying to stay alive long enough for the liberating forces to arrive. The problem was that keeping oneself alive meant helping the Nazis round up others for shipment out of the city, and the shipments were getting larger and more frequent. Some of the Jews had decided that they now had to fight, regardless of the odds. A young man named Mordecai Einelowitz had called upon others in the ghetto to mount a resistance effort. Several men with influence in the ghetto had taken his idea to heart, and had assembled their own troops. Stearman was one such person, and he was the reason Hermann Mann and the others were gathered that evening in the small room. Stearman looked away from the man he had reprimanded and returned to the subject of their meager arsenal. "We have done well to amass these weapons," he said, indicating the guns that lay on the table. "And with them, we have a chance. You are forgetting, my good friends, that we have many, many more weapons available to us now, all with plenty of the proper ammunition, and all in good condition." Exactly right, Erwin Mann thought, as he looked around at the skeptical, tired faces, all but devoid of hope. And Erwin Mann smiled. It was a genuine smile, full of comprehension and expectation, and Stearman saw it instantly. "Let me have the revolver," Erwin said when he saw Stearman looking at him. "It is least likely to malfunction. I will get more weapons for us." All heads swiveled to look at the one who had spoken. "Your name, young man?" Stearman asked softly. Erwin Mann's smile disappeared, and a pained look of shame replaced it. "I am here in Warsaw because my name was known to those who wished to exterminate us. My wife was taken from me. I pray that she is dead." This brought a gasp from some in the group. "I fear that if she is not," he went on, "she may be in a place where she wishes that she were. I am not known here. I have no friends, and I will make none. But if you will give me that revolver, I will bring you more weapons. That is all." "You believe that one of us might somehow betray you by knowing your name?" One of the other men in the group was speaking. His eyes were narrow slits, and his seething anger was quite obvious. "I believe that many things will happen which we cannot now imagine," Mann said levelly. "I know that I can scarcely believe what I have already seen with my own 2 eyes. There is no benefit in any of us having information about each other that we do not need." He looked at Stearman. The old man nodded and handed him the revolver. "I ask the Lord to send us a sign." "He has done so," Stearman said, nodding at Erwin. No one spoke. All eyes were on Erwin Mann as he slid the gun into the side pocket of his tattered, filthy overcoat and briskly walked away from the group. In a few moments, he had vanished up one of the alleys and was gone. Erwin Mann's heart was racing. The bravado he had shown in front of the others had been utter fabrication. He had been terrified that his voice would crack with the fear that was churning in his guts. He knew nothing about guns. He recalled that he had once heard that revolvers were more reliable and easier to use than the other kind of gun, and had suddenly found himself blurting out his demand for a weapon. In truth, He was not sure he knew how to make the gun fire at all. Also, departing from the text for a moment, the myth of revolvers being more reliable than semi-autos is just that, a myth. Perhaps at one time that may have been the case, but with modern technological advances, they are about on par, and if not, autoloaders are typically perhaps even slightly more reliable. In either case, returning now to the text. He recalled that he had once heard that revolvers were more reliable and easier to use than the other kind of gun, and had suddenly found himself blurting out his demand for the weapon. In truth, he was not sure he knew how to make the gun fire at all. The young grocer from Danzig had one tremendous asset, however, and it was what had given him the courage to seize the opportunity to control his own destiny. Hermann Mann was a very analytical person who had an innate understanding of machinery. He let this fact give him comfort as he stepped through the doorway to an abandoned building and walked over to a broken window. With shuffling motions of his feet, Erwin used his ragged boots to sweep the glass and debris away from beneath the window and clear a spot so that he could lie down. He wanted both privacy and decent light. He needed to be able to examine the gun and figure out exactly how it worked before taking any action. He had a plan in mind, but it did not allow for hesitation or uncertainty. The young Jew took the revolver out of his coat pocket. He knew enough to keep the barrel pointed away from any part of his body and his fingers away from the trigger. He did not know how hard you needed to press on the trigger to make the gun fire. He did not think it logical that a slight touch would discharge the weapon, but he had no intention of doing anything rash to find out. Erwin turned the weapon in his hands. He knew the fat bulge in the center was the cylinder. It held the ammunition, 6 shots. He could see the cartridges even though the weapon was closed up and ready to fire. The back edges of the brass cartridge cases could be seen through the space between the back of the cylinder and the chassis of the gun. Was chassis even the right word? He wasn't sure. Hermann Mann looked at the front of the gun, not letting the barrel point straight at his head, but rather angling away from it. His heart jumped when he saw the dull white-gray of oxidized lead visible in the 4 chambers of the cylinder that were not in the top or bottom position, and he was struck with a thrilling thought. If a gun like this is pointed at you, and you are close to it, you can tell if it's loaded or not. He was determined to figure out how to take the ammunition out so that he could better understand how the gun worked. His attention was drawn to the gun's hammer. It stuck up on the back and had grooves machined or filed into it. They looked like they were there to provide a non-slip grip for a finger or thumb. He started to pull the hammer back, and as he did so, he saw the cylinder start to turn. He realized he was starting to cock the weapon, and that was something he did not want to do. He slowly lowered the hammer to its original position. The cylinder stopped turning. He saw that there was no longer a chamber lined up with the barrel of the gun. Erwin touched the cylinder and realized that it now would turn freely. He rotated it with his finger, and when one of the chambers in it containing a cartridge was lined up with the barrel, the cylinder locked into position with an audible click. Mann realized he could no longer turn the cylinder with his hand. I have to unload this weapon, he thought. He looked at what he had believed was the gun's safety catch. It was a serrated, rectangular button on the left side of the gun. He pushed on it. Nothing happened. It was under spring tension and returned to its original rearward position. Erwin pushed it again with the same result. It doesn't feel like anything is broken. Why won't it stay in the new setting? He held the gun up close to his face, looking in all the gaps and spaces between parts as he pressed the button on the left side forward once more. Erwin saw a minute movement of 2 of the internal parts. They were both on the centerline axis of the gun's cylinder. He held the button forward and gripped the gun firmly with his free hand, being careful not to touch the trigger. The cylinder, which had been locked rigidly in place, moved slightly. He pushed on it, first to the right, then the left. It swung out of the gun's frame on a pivoting metal arm. All 6 cartridges were plainly visible. It's not the safety, he thought triumphantly. It's a latch to open the gun and load or unload it. The young man held the gun with the muzzle pointed towards the ceiling of the ruined building, and shook it gently. 3 of the 6 cartridges dropped out of the cylinder into his left hand. The other 3 stayed where they were. Erwin started to look for a stick or a nail to push the remaining ones out from the front. That can't be right, he thought. There must be another way. A slender rod extended from the center of the cylinder. Erwin grabbed it and tried to pull it out, thinking that it was there for the shooter to poke the cartridges out one at a time. It wouldn't move. On an impulse, he pushed on the rod. It immediately slid into the front of the cylinder. At the cylinder's back, a flower-shaped piece of metal underneath the rims of the cartridges extended rearward an equal amount, extracting the remaining rounds of ammunition all at the same time. The cartridges fell on the floor, and when Erwin let go of the rod, it snapped back under spring tension, and the six-pointed piece of metal attached to its back end was once again seated in the rear of the cylinder. Hermann Mann smiled. He looked the empty gun over carefully. He held it up to the light and peered down the bore. Erwin saw 5 spiral grooves evenly spaced, twisted down the barrel's interior. In a sudden flash of inspiration, he realized they were there to make the bullet spin and fly straight, like an American football thrown by an American he had seen on a newsreel 10 years before. As the gun gave up its secrets and revealed the unerring logic of its design, Hermann Mann felt his anxiety replaced with exhilaration, hope, and an overwhelming sense of purpose. In the next hour, by practicing with the empty weapon, Erwin learned that there were 2 ways to make the gun fire. First, as he had seen earlier, if he pulled the hammer back until it caught, the cylinder turned into position and the trigger only took a slight pull to make the hammer fall and fire the gun. If he pulled the trigger without first cocking the hammer, it took a lot more effort and it made the cylinder rotate and the hammer retract before falling on the new chamber at the end of the stroke. There is no safety on a revolver, he realized. The effort and distance required to pull the trigger when the hammer is not cocked makes it impossible for it to happen by accident. He was also acutely aware of another truth. If the ammunition is bad and doesn't go off, I can try the next cartridge just by pulling the trigger again. That's why I had heard that revolvers are easier to use and more reliable. Hermann Mann's confidence continued to increase. For the next hour, the young Jew practiced pulling the empty gun out of the pocket of his overcoat, pointing it at an imagined enemy, and pulling the trigger. He realized that an alert adversary might react to a sudden movement, and he tried holding his left arm bent and in front of his body to ward off defensive maneuvers, keeping his gun hand at his side where it touched his waist just above the hip bone. Gotta find a soldier in the area who's alone, Erwin thought. The patrols invariably travel at least in pairs, and usually in groups of 3. Hermann Mann had no illusions that he would be able to prevail against anything more than a single unsuspecting enemy. But a soldier will go out alone when he's doing something he doesn't want seen by his companions, Erwin reminded himself. This was not unusual. Extortion was common. So was bartering military-issue foodstuffs and medicine for the gold and gems that some of the Jews had brought into Warsaw with them. Rape was also a fact of life. The German soldiers would almost never touch the Jewish women in the area. They were seen as subhuman, after all. Lithuanians and Poles, however, had no such qualms. Maybe I can find one on a solo outing with rape in mind, Erwin thought to himself. His thoughts went to the last time he had seen his wife. I will take great pleasure in changing the man's plans. Most of the soldiers patrolling the ghetto were in fact not Germans. It was considered light duty, and much of the work was performed by Lithuanian militiamen and Polish police who were viewed with scorn by Nazi soldiers. The benefit of this fact was that if a Lithuanian or Pole went missing, he would be assumed to have skipped out. No one would think he had been a victim of an ambush, Erwin reassured himself. Not the first one, at least. There is also the matter of noise, Erwin reminded himself. Even when I find a lone soldier, I must be sure that others do not rush in too soon at the sound of a shot. Risky though it might be, he decided that his best chance would be to shove the barrel of the gun into the fabric of the thick uniform coat that the soldiers wore before pulling the trigger. It would mean rushing up to the intended victim instead of shooting him from a position of concealment, but Erwin decided it still offered the best probability of success. I will also be a lot less likely that I'll miss. He carefully reloaded the revolver and put it back in the right pocket of his coat. From the left pocket he withdrew the other weapon that he intended to use. It was a well-worn but serviceable pair of small Zeiss folding binoculars. He had managed to acquire them several weeks before from a young woman who had also been relocated to the Warsaw ghetto. Hermann Mann had not been sure how he would use them, but he had never doubted that they would become a great asset. Using the field glasses, Erwin looked out the broken window and up and down the street. He saw only other Jews trudging beside the buildings. Only one thing to do, then, he decided. It's time to go hunting. Mann went back out the doorway and walked into the street. His head was bowed as he took on the defeated, hopeless air of the other residents of the city. But his spirits were soaring. For the first time in months, he felt truly alive. It didn't take long. Within a few blocks, he came upon a German soldier who had just finished using the butt of his rifle on a man who appeared to be about 65 years old, but who was actually 51. "Filthy cur! You will not again waste my time when you have nothing to trade. Or perhaps you'll be on Friday's train and there won't be a next time, eh?" The soldier had just finished reslinging his rifle over his shoulder when Hermann Mann acted. The young Jew thrust the barrel of the .38 caliber revolver against the soldier's spine between his shoulder blades, pushed it into the man with both of his hands. He was driving forward just as he would if he had no gun and were trying to shove the soldier across the street. As he felt the man's body start to give under the unexpected force, Erwin pulled the trigger. He had expected the technique to somewhat muffle the report of the gun, and he was not disappointed. As with any revolver, some high-pressure gases escaped between the thin gap between the cylinder and the barrel, so the sound of the shot was still there. But all the burning powder that normally would have blasted out the muzzle was trapped inside the body. That caused a result that Hermann Mann had not expected. With the muzzle of the gun pressed firmly against the Nazi's back, not only had the bullet entered his flesh, but the entire explosive force of the burning powder and high-pressure gases behind the bullet in the barrel of the gun had been directed into the man's flesh as well. The net effect was the same as if a small explosive charge had been detonated inside the soldier's body. On the vertebrae, the ends of 2 ribs, part of 1 lung, and the edge of the man's heart were destroyed in a millisecond. A slurry of these ruined parts sloshed down onto the dead man's diaphragm, leaving a cavity the size of a cantaloupe where the organs had been just a moment before. As this happened, the barrel of the gun slid into the entrance hole in the soldier's back, and the jagged bottom of the upper section of his ruined spine snagged the gun's front sight. Hermann Mann, who was holding the revolver with an adrenaline-charged grip, was pulled down on top of the falling body. The force of his own weight landing on the dead Nazi drove the air out of the remaining lungs and made a retching sound that startled the young man. In the instant before his mind realized what had happened, he thought the man might still be alive. Erwin immediately leapt to his feet, withdrawing the gun from the soldier's back. He was acutely aware of the gore which dripped from it as he thrust the revolver back into his pocket and grabbed the corpse by the ankles. Erwin turned his head so that if the old man that the soldier had clubbed was looking, he would not see Erwin's face. His heart was racing, and with the strength that fear and excitement can bring, he quickly dragged the body into the alley. The Jew had half expected to feel nausea after the killing, but the fear of discovery and the fact that his job was far from over combined to fully occupy his senses. He would not feel the magnitude of what he had just done until much later. Erwin's first surprise was that it was harder to remove an overcoat from a dead body than he had ever imagined. After the coat was off, the former grocer wrapped the rifle in it so that it would be a little less conspicuous. He also took the spare ammunition for the rifle, the 9mm auto-loading pistol from the man's belt holster, the spare loaded pistol magazines, and a handful of paper currency. He pulled off the man's boots and socks and cut off his shirt and pants with a pair of tailor's shears he had carried in his pocket for the purpose. He then covered the body with debris from the alley. Erwin hoped that, to a casual glance from another soldier, it would look like just another Jew who had died of starvation or exposure. The discovery of a slain German soldier would be big news indeed, and elicit a response he could not afford. Using a different route, Erwin returned to a building he knew was unoccupied. He knew it was vacant because one of the weaker inhabitants of the Warsaw ghetto had died in the basement 6 days earlier, and the corpse was still there. The stench was terrible, but it discouraged others from using either the basement or the ground floor of the building. Erwin stayed long enough to study the rifle to make sure he understood how it worked. The rifle was a Mauser 8mm Model 98, a bolt-action weapon whose method of function was immediately obvious even to someone with no previous experience. Lifting the round end of the bolt handle rotated the bolt and unlocked it so that it could be drawn to the rear. Pushing the bolt forward from that position placed a cartridge in the chamber, and pushing the handle back down again, locked the breech and rendered the gun ready to fire. Erwin drew back the rifle's bolt and saw a full load of ammunition in the magazine. The top round slipped under the extractor as the bolt reached its rearward limit. He pushed the bolt forward and the top cartridge slid into the chamber. Erwin retracted the bolt once more, and the cartridge was thrown out onto the floor. The young man practiced the maneuver until all the cartridges lay at his feet. He was satisfied that he understood the weapon's basic functionality. It did not dawn on Hermann Mann that the rifle had had no round in the chamber when the soldier had been carrying it. Erwin wrapped the rifle, the Luger, and the ammunition in the soldier's coat and stowed them under the stairs. He left the overpowering smell of the basement and went outside. It was time to look for more prey. In the next 3 hours, using much the same technique, Hermann Mann killed 2 more armed enemies. The first was a sallow-looking Lithuanian. The other was a conscript of indeterminate origin. The young grocer's efforts netted him 2 more 8mm Mauser rifles, a 7.62mm Polish Nagant revolver, a Walther P38 9mm pistol, 72 cartridges, 3 packs of cigarettes, a gravity knife, more Deutschmarks, and some Polish Zlots. Both soldiers had been carrying their rifles with empty chambers. The handguns had loaded chambers and had been ready to fire, but they had been carried in flap holsters with thongs tying the flaps shut. It would have taken the soldiers less time to load their rifles than to get their pistols free from their holsters. Hermann Mann was too excited to notice this fact. The 4th soldier Erwin chose was a Lithuanian carrying an MP-28 submachine gun. He had spotted him just before dusk by using the binoculars and decided that he had to get the gun. His people would need such a weapon for when they were attacked by a group of Nazis coming to take them away. Erwin knew it would not be a matter of if, but of when. Bunches of Jews were being herded out of the overcrowded ghetto and into railway cars every day. None, of course, had ever returned, but the crude comments of the stormtroopers could not be discounted. The Jews were being sent to mass executions. Erwin used the same technique that had worked successfully thrice before. The soldier had just started to turn when the muzzle of the revolver, backed by 70 kilos of charging 25-year-old, hit him just below the right shoulder blade and knocked him off balance as Hermann Mann pulled the trigger. Click. Whether the round of ammunition had gone bad, or whether the gun's mainspring was just a little too weak to always fire the cartridges reliably, Hermann Mann would never know. What he did realize in the instant that he landed on top of the startled soldier was that he was going to have to use his bare hands to kill this man, a man with a machine gun. The soldier was young and in good physical condition, and his reflexes were quick. He had been taken completely by surprise, however, and this was the first time he had actually fought for his life at close quarters. As he landed on his left side with the young Jew tumbling on top of him, he made the common error of trying to get his weapon into play rather than react with a quicker, though less lethal response. Hermann Mann instinctively pounded at the soldier's face with his right fist, which was still holding the revolver. The barrel punched into Private Mueller's right eye socket just as Hermann Mann did another instinctive thing and pulled the trigger. The gun did not misfire this time. The explosion of the cartridge was again contained, but this time within a much smaller and less elastic space than the chest cavity of a grown man. This time the pressure was released inside a small chamber made of thick bone. Fluid dynamics dictated that the soldier's brain matter be driven out of his skull through the path of least resistance. And it was. The bullet severed the left optic nerve, and Private Mueller's left eyeball was blown out of his head. It came to rest almost 10 meters down the street, where it was soon eaten by one of the many scavenging creatures that fed on corpses before work details hauled them away. Brain matter followed the eyeball, and a small amount also came out of the dead man's ears and nostrils. The balance of the gray tissue followed the bullet out the hole it had made in the occipital region at the back of the soldier's head. The soft lead bullet was stopped by Private Mueller's helmet, and it left a visible dent which gave the steel headpiece the incongruous appearance of a large green woman's breast. The helmet also prevented the bullet from shattering Hermann Mann's left hand, which it would have done if the young private had been bareheaded. Hermann Mann scrambled to his feet. This time the sight of the dead man had a definite effect on him. The soldier's face had been barely a foot from his own, and seeing the man's brains spilled out of the eye socket and clinging to the back of Erwin's hand had suddenly made the young grocer feel lightheaded and faint. Mann realized he could not afford to indulge in revulsion. He wiped his right hand, which still clutched the revolver, on the soldier's tunic. For a final time that day, he dragged the dead weight out of sight where it would not immediately be discovered. The sling of the MP-28 submachine gun slid off the dead man's shoulder, and Erwin ran quickly back to the middle of the street to retrieve the weapon. This time, he did not strip the corpse. Erwin removed his own coat and slung the short weapon over his back. After removing its magazine, when he put the coat back on and fastened the 2 buttons, it still remained. The gun was not visible. The man had carried no sidearm or other weapon, and Erwin soon learned why. To his great pleasure, he discovered that the soldier had been carrying 6 spare loaded magazines for his MP-28, in addition to the one that had been in the gun. Erwin would not know exactly that he had another 175 rounds of ammunition until he unloaded the magazines and counted the cartridges. But he knew it was a lot. Fine work for my first day on the new job, he thought. He put the 7 magazines into the left side pocket of his coat. They were too long and protruded several inches out the top. Erwin cut a section from the dead soldier's shirt and tied it around the exposed ends of the magazines. Dusk had come, and the makeshift cover would be adequate for the journey back to where he had hidden the other weapons. Hermann Mann walked briskly out of the alley and down the street. His discomfort at the sight of the man's ruined face was completely forgotten.
when the Nazis was the rule on Poland. 1939, and the Allies turned away. From the underground rose a hope of freedom as a whisper. City in despair, but they never lost their faith. Women, men, and children fight, they were dying side by side. And the blood they shed upon the streets was a sacrifice willingly paid. Warsaw, city at war, voices from underground, whispers of freedom. 1944, help that never came. Calling Warsaw, city at war, voices from underground, whispers of freedom. Rise up and hear the call, history calling to you. In accordance with the old traditions. 1944, still the Allies turned away. Fighting street to street in a time of hope and desperation. Did it on their own, and they never lost their faith. Women, men, and children fight, they were dying side by side. And the blood they shed upon the streets was a sacrifice willingly paid. Warsaw, city at war, voices from underground, whispers of freedom. 1944, help that never came. Calling Warsaw, city at war, voices from underground, whispers of freedom. Rise up and hear the call, history calling to you. But